My name is David Scobie. I'm the dean of the New School for. Thanks a lot. I'm the dean of the New School for Public Engagement here at the New School, and it's my great pleasure to give you a dean's welcome to Ties That Bind: Reimagining Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare for Teens, Families, and Communities, a child welfare forum presented by our Center for New York City Affairs. I say that I'm giving you the dean's welcome because it's a full-throated, passionate, and sincere welcome to a vibrant event that I don't have time to stay for. But I do have the privilege of being able to convene it. The New School for Public Engagement is one of 7 divisions at the New School, and it's especially committed to the ideals of interdisciplinary engagement with the larger issues, social and cultural issues of the city and the world. We have programs in urban policy, in nonprofit management, in media studies, and international affairs, and many other topics. But learning that it combines theory and practice and engages the world's great issues is our kind of core DNA, as is a commitment to vibrant public programming that brings together the city public and the larger public around the most important public issues of the day, and nothing could be more important than this. Within our mission, the Center for New York City Affairs is squarely in our sweet spot, and I'm proud and delighted that we host the city within the New School. The mission of the city is a unique one, I think, for an academic institution, integrating policy analysis and research and advocacy and public communications meant to inform public policy in New York, especially around issues that affect working class communities and families and children, and aim to make a more decent and just city and metropolitan community for them. Today's forum on issues of juvenile justice couldn't be more important as part of that of those goals, and I know this is a propitious moment for the reform and strengthening of the juvenile justice system. So this is an important topic at an important time. I want to thank, before we begin, the funders who've made this morning's event possible. They include the Ira DeCamp Foundation, the Viola Bernard Foundation, the Child Welfare Fund, the Cyrus Fund, and of course the Milano Foundation. The Center for New York City Affairs is part of the Milano School within our division. I'm deeply grateful to all of those supporters of the work of this forum and of the center. I also want to thank the able and terrific staff of the Center for New York City Affairs, and especially its director and my colleague, Andrew White. And I want to turn the podium over to Andrew to frame up the discussion and introduce our guests for today. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Don't forget your pad. Good morning.
Thanks.
I'm very glad you could all be here. The center is, as David said, the center is dedicated to advancing innovation and effectiveness in the programs and services that government runs and government funds in New York City, particularly as they affect children and families and low-income and working-class neighborhoods in the city. Our Child Welfare Watch project includes in-depth reports, and it also includes the frequent email updates that I hope you're all getting now. Fairly soon, we're going to be changing our web-based mechanism for getting that out there so that there will be room for comments and discussion as well. And if you're not receiving all of that, please put your business card or write your name down on the out on the table out in the lobby so you can be added to the list. You've heard who's supporting our work. I want to add to that the United Way for New York City and the Pinkerton Foundation, who are also supporting the work we're doing here. And especially the people who put this project together, Abigail Kramer and Kendra Hurley, and Jackie Wayans and Anna Schneider. And and I also want to thank the New School for its help and the Dean. So how the morning will unfold. I'm going to speak first because I want to talk a little bit about the new issue of Child Welfare Watch and how it ties into the last couple of issues, which were about teens and about juvenile justice. The newest one is about community partnerships. I see them all as interrelated very closely. But after I speak, and I'll try and cut myself off because we're going to introduce Commissioner Richter, and he unfortunately has been called into a meeting with the mayor that starts at 10 o'clock, so he's going to have to leave early, around 9:40. So we'll have time for him to talk. We'll bring the panel up. We'll go through some of the discussion. We'll get a couple of questions in from the audience before the commissioner leaves, and then his deputy, Larry Bushing, will come up on the panel. But nonetheless, I have some comments that I want to make. So over the last couple of years, we've published 3 issues of Child Welfare Watch. The first was on the desperate need for change in the state's juvenile justice system, the juvenile corrections system upstate primarily. The second was on teens aging out of foster care and their very high rates of homelessness and family instability. And then most recently, just last month, we published an issue that gets far less, an issue about a topic that gets far less attention and far fewer resources, but it's also of critical importance, whether you work in child welfare or in juvenile justice. And that's the partnerships between these systems and the communities they serve. It's the often unrecognized collaborations between the nonprofit agencies, government, and community institutions, including just residents themselves, congregations, and other informal associations. For the last few years, ACS has funded community partnerships in 11 New York City neighborhoods. The partnerships receive only a modest amount of funds, just $150,000 apiece from the city. But in some neighborhoods, they play an outsized role. In some of these communities, and there's great variation across the 11 partnerships if you know them, in some of these communities, the partnerships are helping promote participation of local people and organizations in critical aspects of the child welfare system. They're creating a degree of transparency and understanding for child welfare and for how that system works and for how child protection works. In some communities, the partnerships are helping to organize networks of services for supporting families. In a few cases, they're actually getting local congregations and residents to help parents who are in difficult situations. And as we write in this report and in other things the center has published, we've seen in New York and in other cities how this kind of network can help protect children from neglect and can help keep families away from the edge of a severe crisis. In our reporting, we've also seen a couple of projects within the partnerships that are proving to be very interesting and in some cases very valuable tools for improving the practice of child welfare. And we'll talk about some of these on the panel. The first is the inclusion of community representatives in ACS child safety conferences. So when a parent is first investigated on the suspicion of abuse or neglect, and Child Protective Services decides that they need to remove and place the child in foster care, they call a child safety conference. And last year, in about 15% of these cases, community partnerships sent either a parent advocate or another community representative from the local neighborhood near the field office to the session. These are trained community reps, and their role is to give parents their moral support, to help them understand what's going on, to help them have a voice in that conference, to express their opinions, and if possible, to help them understand what they need to do next to make sure that their kid comes home. I won't go into great detail here, but in sitting in on these sessions and in interviewing participants, we've seen some incredibly impressive results. They don't always work, but in many cases, it very clearly changes the dynamic of the conference. And sometimes they can help move the case in such a productive direction that a child goes home quickly or doesn't leave the home. The other especially valuable program that we write about in this report is about the visiting hosts and visit coaches for foster children and their parents, which have been coordinated by some of the partnerships. For a decade, advocates and staff at ACS and at some of the foster care agencies have tried hard to find more hospitable and positive ways for parents to spend time with their children who are in foster care. It's a fundamental part of helping children return home. Having a good visit regularly is one of the best things you can do to help a child get home. But in the antiseptic city offices of an agency, it's not always the best place. So alternative spaces are valuable, and that's what the partnerships have been able to bring, along with the coaches. So the partnerships do invaluable work, but the reality is they remain on the margins of the foster care system, and that's really what much of the report is about. They're starved for resources, and they haven't really had the opportunity to prove their effectiveness in the way that's needed. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, and there's recommendations in the front of the report that come from our advisory board. More to the point of today's session, there may well be valuable ways for the community partnerships to play a role in organizing local engagement in realms beyond child protection and foster care, including juvenile justice and youth development and health care and mental health, senior services, and so on. And some of them are trying to do that, but again, these are very small organizations. The communities we're talking about today, the neighborhoods where the partnerships are active, are among those with the very highest rates of involvement with both child welfare and juvenile justice services. And the numbers are fairly staggering. We recently calculated that more than 1/10 of the city's school-age children, more than 100,000 children, come into contact with either child welfare or juvenile justice services every year in New York City. And that's not counting kids younger than school age, and that's not counting teens who are stopped and frisked and even arrested if they don't go into detention. So that's a lot of our fellow New Yorkers. These are communities under constant engagement with government services, and in New York City, as in many cities, to be a poor family that's connected with these systems is to be a family under a microscope. As most of you know, ACS is in the midst of two very high-profile or potentially high-profile projects that offer a great deal of hope of improvement for teens and their families in these neighborhoods. The first is the realignment of the city's juvenile justice system. If the plan put forward by Governor Cuomo and Mayor Bloomberg last month goes forward through the legislature, young teens in trouble with the law will no longer be sent hundreds of miles away to correctional facilities run by the state, at least those who would have been adjudicated to non-secure and limited secure placement. Instead, most of them will remain in or near the city in residences or alternative programs run by nonprofit organizations. This follows on years of work developing alternatives like the ACS Juvenile Justice Initiative, which provides intensive supports and counseling, family counseling, to help young people remain at home with their families, even after they've committed some serious crimes. The second big innovation emerging at ACS builds directly on that initiative, and it's an effort to take the lessons of the Juvenile Justice Initiative and related programs that the city has used to apply them into child welfare to prevent teenagers from being placed in foster care. So in the next hour and a half, we'll try to discuss all of this, or at least some of it. As I said, Commissioner Richter has to leave at about 9:40, so we're going to do our best to get a couple of questions in with him, but the session will continue all the way till 10:30. Ron Richter has worked on many sides of these issues. He's been a law guardian at Legal Aid. He's been the head of ACS's family court team. He's been a city hall policymaker, and he's been a judge in family court. Now he's not only legally responsible for 14,000 foster children, but he's also the boss of nearly 7,000 employees. I'm not sure which is the bigger challenge. Commissioner Richter.
Ooh, you're showing my first slide before they're supposed to see it. You're giving it away.
All right, so you just press that.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to apologize. I shouldn't start with an apology, but the reason that I am leaving a little early is not because I don't want to answer your questions, although it might seem that way, but because yesterday we got an announcement that the mayor is going to be releasing his budget today to the public at 1 o'clock, and he is doing a briefing at 10 o'clock with all of the city's agency heads. And so I am an agency head, and so I need to be at City Hall at 10 o'clock to be briefed by the mayor. So I apologize that there was a collision in obligations, and so that is where I will be at 10 o'clock. But I'm here, and I am pleased to participate in this Milano School New Schools Forum on Reimagining Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare for Teens, Families, and Communities. The timing is perfect. I want to begin by thanking Andrew White and the Center for New York City Affairs for being such dedicated advocates for the children and families of New York City. Andrew mentioned Kendra and Abigail. They have been consistent and supportive, and while I may not personally in this current role endorse everything that's in this most recent edition of The Watch, there's no question that The Watch is exactly what its title says, and that is that it watches in more depth what we are doing in child welfare and juvenile justice than any other journal of its kind. And in New York City, we are so fortunate to have so many individuals who are carefully looking out for our kids, our youth, our families, and thinking in such careful ways about what we're doing, not just government, but our providers, and even advocates looking at advocates and asking about whether the things that we're looking to do and fighting for make the most sense for the people that we care about. And that really says a lot. And The Watch thinks about it, puts it out there, and creates forums like this to help us ask questions of those of us who are actually making some of the decisions. So thank you very much to Andrew and the Center. At the report that we're all here talking about initially, talks about some of the positive impacts of the community partnerships, including, as Andrew mentioned, the benefits of our family team conferences. And as many of you know, family team conferences have been around for a long time out there in the country and serve as a model to bring participants that families know about into critical decisions in child welfare. And we have seen, not surprisingly, that in one case at critical decisions when children may be removed from parents, we have actually seen that when there are family members and community members present at team conferences, the number of removals goes down. You also see that when family team conference is properly facilitated, parents come out feeling as though they didn't have an experience that was as tumultuous and difficult as they might otherwise have had. So while Children's Services may not agree with all of the conclusions and recommendations that the Watch included, we certainly will think about them, and they will inform us as we move forward. Chapin Hall is conducting an evaluation of community partnerships currently for ACS and is focusing on 3 specific activities. Conferencing, with a specific focus on the differences in outcomes when a community representative participates in a case conference, the impact that a community member can have as a supervisor during visits for parents and children when children are in out-of-home care, and the impact that community partners or community representatives can have in helping us recruit foster families. And this is critical because we're not just looking for community partners to help us stand on street corners in the most crass way and say to neighbors, would you consider being a foster parent, and if you will, please sign this list. We are looking for community partners to certify foster homes, to pursue leads and help us get foster families recruited and certified in the neighborhoods where our kids need foster homes. That's a tall order, but that's what we want to see community partners do. And so we have Chapin Hall looking at those three activities. This analysis will help us assess the program, the progress that each partnership has made and what they're capable of doing with respect to what we think these three core activities represent, and what we think are benchmarks of success and evidence of progress. Now, it's obvious to most of you and obvious to me that these aren't the only activities that we could be looking at. Many people advocate for community partnerships being stationed in schools, for example. Having a social worker in a local school and having a school refer a parent to a community partner so that there's support for parents in helping young people get to school. That's a different use of a community partner, helping families reduce the occurrence of truancy. There are lots of different, and the list could go on. That's one other example. We've decided to focus on these three activities because we think they are clearly linked to child welfare outcomes that we care about. Making conferences more effective, making visiting more effective because we think that will reduce the length of stay for kids in care, and recruiting good foster homes in neighborhoods where our kids come from so that they have less disruption. They can stay in the same schools. So we picked these three activities because we think they matter a lot. But there's no question that we could have picked other activities. Again, I want to acknowledge that Child Welfare Watch's focus on these partnerships matters. I'm going to move on and talk a little bit next about reimagining juvenile justice and child welfare for teens, the next topic on our agenda. It is fortuitous that we have this on the agenda as ACS is currently expanding services and planning for teens to secure their futures. This, as you may know, is one of the 6 priorities recently released in our strategic plan for the agency, and there are 2 areas where we are focused on teens that I'm going to talk about. The first, as Andrew mentioned, is expanding in-home intensive services for teens to reduce maltreatment and subsequent placement of teens in foster care, and then, as Andrew also mentioned, the city and state's efforts at reforming our juvenile justice system. So we're moving away from the partnerships and into juvenile justice and teen services, our teen services pilot. Okay, so the discussion of our teen services pilot project is to provide intensive home-based therapeutic services to teens and their families involved in or at risk of entering the child welfare system. And I want to be clear here that our belief, Children's Services' value, is that by building strong families, we are building strong communities. There's a lot of conversation out there about the fact that ACS has not recently been about partnerships with communities. And it is critical, in our view, that without supporting families, without helping parents keep their children at home, without helping parents get their children to school, keeping their children out of trouble, giving parents real guidance in keeping them out of the criminal justice system, keeping them in positive activities, helping them raise their teen so that they can then raise their younger children effectively, we are not creating the fabric for safe communities. And our belief is that by supporting parents with robust, real preventive services, we are, in fact, as a government agency, as Children's Services, building strong communities. And these services are going into our city's neighborhoods where our reports are coming from, which are the neighborhoods that you know of. Do you want me to take questions while? Not yet. Okay. So building upon our successes using evidence-based models and the Juvenile Justice Initiative and Family Assessment Program, ACS is expanding our evidence-based models of preventive services to meet the critical needs of teens who are at risk of foster care placement as the result of child abuse and maltreatment. And as I said, our belief that families are the fabric of our communities and evidence-based models such as functional family therapy and multisystemic therapy are all about empowering parents to keep their teens at home. We think that we can help to keep New York City's communities intact, keeping our youth there at home being raised by their parents. Evidence-based models, and I'm going to move to our first slide. There it is. Evidence-based models are based on validated research demonstrating good outcomes. They've all been studied over the course of the past 35 years. They're home-based so that young people remain at home instead of coming into our foster care system where we know that teens have poor outcomes. They're holistic. Instead of families being referred to lots of different providers, it's one licensed social worker at the kitchen table working with the mother, the child. It's usually a mother. If there's a father, it's the father. If there are siblings, siblings. They're focused on a concrete model of family engagement where there are clear expectations not just for the family, but also for the therapist, so that there's equality there in the model, and there is consistent quality assurance built into the model so that you don't just have the family and the provider working together. You also have a layer of integrity from the model developer that you pay for, which makes this model cost more. These evidence-based, I like to think of it as the social worker at the kitchen table. There is a real presence in the delivery of this model at the home. So it is not the parent dragging the kid to an agency. It is the door, the front door getting a knock consistently from a social worker who is in your face at your kitchen table, being part of your life. And it is not a long-term kind of intervention. It is relatively short in the way we work with families. They come in, like a tornado kind of thing, and they help the parent learn how to get control. And they make it very clear to the teen that their parent is the parent. They are not the one who's going to set the rules. The parent is. And that message needs to be set very strongly. And so the initial intervention is quite powerful, 4-5 times a week for a substantial amount of hours. And then it recedes. These evidence-based modalities include, as I said, functional family therapy, which is known as FFT. These are the big acronyms. Multidimensional family therapy, MDFT, multisystemic therapy, MST, and then there are adaptations. Multidimensional treatment foster care, MDFT. You could really go crazy. Learn them all. I've been saying them long enough that I kind of know them. Since 2007, as some of you know, New York City Children's Services has used, through our Juvenile Justice Initiative, these models to provide intensive evidence-based services for youth in our juvenile justice system. The goals of JJI are to promote public safety in our juvenile justice system and to reduce recidivism, to stop kids from committing crimes. And we have done so. Improved individual and family functioning is obviously also a goal. control, reduce the number of delinquent youth in residential facilities because kids do not belong in institutions, and safely shorten our lengths of stay for youth that are placed in residential care. So that means that instead of keeping a young person in an institution for 2-3 years, we are shortening the length of stay by setting up aftercare that is one of these models. Slide 2. And there are the results. Investment in evidence-based alternatives to placement program and aftercare. This is what's happened in New York City since December 2005. Those are the numbers of kids that New York City has sent to the state, and the numbers have gone down. Our investment in JJI and juvenile justice reform efforts have paid dividends, not in money as much as in lives. As you can see here, we've gone from over 1,467 youth in 2005 being placed in OCFS-operated facilities and private placements to a little less than 550 youth. That means that those youth are at home in their communities with their parents being parented, going to school in their schools, not with 100% attendance, not getting A's, not necessarily on the honor roll, but not getting rearrested for higher level crimes most of the time, but at home, seeing a different future than being in prison prep, quite frankly. And that's positive. That's positive for the fabric of our communities. Okay, slide 3. Am I on? Yeah, I think I'm going to slide 3. Based on what we've learned with our success in JJI, early last year, ACS launched a new continuum of evidence-based services that is now available to our PINS youth, and that is through our family assessment program known as FAP. So this is what's going on in FAP. FAP provides diversion services to thousands of families each year who are seeking to file a PINS petition in family court. PINS are also known as status offenders or CHINS kids, depending on what state you come from. I think Massachusetts, they call them CHINS. Youth up to 18 who are charged with offenses unique to their status as juveniles, including truancy, ungovernability, and running away from home. For anyone who's worked in family court, there are Article 7 cases. People see them. They drop the petition and run in the other direction. There's not that much that the family court can do about these cases. So what ACS has tried to do is figure out how to get at the front door with probation and do something helpful for these families. And we think that in a lot of cases, these are kids who have really troubled circumstances. They've got parents who are at their wits' end. No parent in their right mind wants to come to the family court with their teenager. And so what we've done is we've tried to stop the family dysfunction earlier, prevent delinquency, and offer these evidence-based models. As you can see from the slide, based on the data, we've been able to reduce the number of PINs from 523 in 2010 to 393 in 2011. That's a reduction of approximately 25% in the course of less than a year. Again, progress. And our goal is to take these kinds of models of intensive services that have been proven to work and apply them to the child welfare setting. And so where we are going here is that ACS is going to, in the calendar year 2010, address the fact that 32%, or 19,313 of our abuse and maltreatment investigations that have been conducted by our Division of Child Protection involved teens. So let me say that again. 32% of our Division of Child Protection investigations in 2010 involved teens. So that's a third. And these investigations resulted in about 1,400 teens being placed in foster care. And I will repeat what I said earlier. Teens in foster care is generally not going to result in good outcomes because teens don't like to be in care. Teens like to be at home. And so what you're setting yourself up for are putting your providers in a tough spot because they really struggle with teenagers, as does anyone who's ever raised a teenager know. And so we are now moving programmatically to deal with this stagnation because our approach thus far has been unsuccessful. So we are going to now be proactive so that the numbers don't continue to stay the same. ACS is committed to preventing out-of-home placement of these teens as long as home-based therapeutic services will be able to help teenagers remain in their communities at home with their parents. ACS anticipates that by providing home-based intensive services like the services I described, we'll be able to further reduce foster care placements, improving family functioning, reducing truancy, and other teen-specific behaviors, which is what these models are designed to do. And we hope this will, as I've said many times, keep families together in their communities and empower parents, which is the goal. We are currently piloting these models of intensive preventive services in Manhattan. That's not the right slide, I don't think. It's fine? Okay. We are currently being told it's fine. We're currently piloting these intensive preventive services in Manhattan and in one zone in the Bronx. In phase one, ACS will be working with 2 of our current providers who provide evidence-based services. I see them here. New York Foundling is doing functional family therapy child welfare program, FFT-CW, that's another acronym, and Children's Village, also here, and I believe on the advisory board, so this is probably a conflict for me to mention it, Multi-Systemic Therapy Program, MST. During this phase of the project, ACS is going to be tracking the cases to identify lessons learned to inform practice modifications and ultimately citywide implementation. We recently released a concept paper, which is available on our website, that describes these services. We will be issuing a request for proposals for additional evidence-based services and other promising practices that have been implemented successfully with the teen population and child welfare systems. This is a substantial investment in evidence-based models in child welfare. It is a hefty number. We believe that by making this financial commitment to families and teenagers, because the numbers are so significant in terms of the reports, that we will empower parents to take care of their teenagers, which has driven for so many years the number of teens coming into care. And again, by empowering parents, we will strengthen the fabric of our communities. That's the goal. I think that I am now going to move on to juvenile justice realignment because I'm talking too much. So, juvenile justice realignment. Again, I think that the stars have been aligned with Governor Cuomo, Mayor Bloomberg, and I do want to say the foundation that has been laid by Commissioner Gladys Carrion over the years to really set us up to be in a position to do what I hope we are about to do, which is enact the legislation called Close to Home. You know, we have been talking a lot about this law and what it could mean, and I don't think that you can for a moment not stop and cherish the opportunity to have New York City's youth moved hundreds of miles south to actually be confined when necessary in locations that are just miles away from their mothers and fathers and siblings to be rehabilitated. And while there, of course, in New York City, when anything like this happens, is immediately a rush to ask hundreds of important questions about how we're going to do this right. And I am a New Yorker through and through, so I wouldn't expect anything other than hundreds and hundreds of questions, and I feel very lucky that I'm the person standing before you because the questions are all coming at me and my team and Commissioner Schiraldi's team, and well, they should be. But I don't want those questions to stop us from cherishing the moment that we are in, that we that the stars have been aligned and we may actually be able to bring our kids home. Because when you talk about strengthening communities and empowering parents, we may never see this moment again. So we should really celebrate that we got here. Because if this legislation passes, it will be a real opportunity for young people and their families in New York City. The buses will no longer be heading upstate, and parents, namely mothers, will no longer be crying the loss of their kids. We will do it in a way that the public is safe, and that is a critical component of this, and in a way that children will be educated and get DOE credit, and in a way that children's psychiatric needs are met. This is a heavy lift, but we should cherish the moment that we're being offered this opportunity. So as part of the state budget proposal, Governor Cuomo included an initiative called Close to Home to ensure that New York City youth involved in the juvenile justice system receive services in New York City. It is a sweeping reform that transfers responsibility for all but the most dangerous young people placed by New York City Family Court, and that's the designated felons, placed by New York City Family Court in New York City. That's non-secure and limited secure, so that they can be rehabilitated, supervised, and when necessary, confined near their families in their communities. Close to home, is that right? Close to home does not affect youth in OCFS secure. Those are the juvenile offenders. So we're looking at about 600 youth who will be receiving services in the city, including those currently served in non-secure and limited secure. Family court judges will retain discretion to set minimum sentences for young people placed in limited secure placements, just like their colleagues in the rest of the state. In addition, as mentioned, New York City is going to build on its success using evidence-based alternatives to placement that reduce recidivism to keep our city safe. And Commissioner Schiraldi at the Department of Probation is also working on innovative models that are alternatives to placement to add to the continuum. Many of you are already aware of the work that he is doing. Parents, as I've described, are going to have a social worker working closely with them in these alternative to placement models. I don't need to repeat that. The city will work with not-for-profit providers to build a continuum of non-secure and limited secure residential placements for the youth who require various levels of confinement that train young people how to manage their behaviors while protecting and supporting neighborhoods. Locally operated programs will be more cost-effective than state placements. Young people in the realigned close-to-home juvenile justice system will be educated by New York City school teachers and earn Department of Education school credits toward graduation. The city will develop a plan that will be submitted to the state for public comment, and as we work on the plan, we are meeting with and listening to input from young people, their family members, legislators, community members, advocates, and others, so that our plan reflects their perspectives. We are currently working on identifying which communities, which 5 communities the most kids come from that are currently in placement, and we are setting up community forums for parents and kids and other interested parties to come to. This was a suggestion that just recently came up at one of my first advisory board as the commissioner, and we are working on that right now so that we can actually publicize these meetings and go out, myself, Larry Bushing, who you'll hear from, and others from ACS, to give actual community members the opportunity to have input into what this plan should look like. There we go. A Rely New York City juvenile justice program will be overseen by staff members of the Office of Children and Family Services dedicated to the oversight of the city's juvenile placement program. The young people in care will also have the benefit of ready access to their families, probably the people who care most about them in the world, and attorneys, social workers, and therapists who will be much closer and easier to consult with under the current system. You cannot overstate the value of young people having their lawyers in the same place that they are, as a former children's lawyer. In addition, the New York City Council has been a critical partner with the city in the development of program priorities for youth currently served in the juvenile justice system, along with their council oversight role of our work, both of which they will continue to play in a realigned system. Realignment, as I said, builds on Mayor Bloomberg's redesign of the city's juvenile justice detention system and development of alternatives to placement so that youth, whenever possible, may remain at home with intensive services consistent with public safety and risk assessment. These reforms have achieved the twin goals of simultaneously reducing both confinement and reoffending, and we are grateful for the mayor's longstanding commitment to reform over the course of his administration. And I am again going to acknowledge and thank OCFS Commissioner Gladys Carrion. She, too, has been a champion of young people involved in our juvenile justice system during her tenure. She has highlighted the limitations of the state system and led the efforts to reform and improve it. It should be noted that Commissioner Gladys Carrion also established the first Missouri model in New York City, known as Brooklyn for Brooklyn, or B for B. It focuses on the positive development of youth in a setting linked close to their homes and communities. We look forward to forming a work group, I think we're starting next week with Commissioner Carrion, to work on the plan to transition services for youth in non-secure and limited secure settings to the city. And of course, we are ever grateful to Governor Cuomo's leadership for including this bold initiative in his budget and reform proposal. We believe that this will produce better outcomes for our kids and their families while maintaining public safety. There is much work to be accomplished in the coming months, and we welcome the opportunity to be partners with interested members of the community who want to improve the future of our city's youth. The opposite of closer to home is far away from home, and nobody wants our kids to be far away from home. In conclusion, I hope that you find these two plans, investing in preventive services for our teenagers that are evidence-based and that are modeled on JJI and FAP, hopeful. And I hope you see them as investing in parents, which is investing in our communities. I hope you find them exciting. I know you must find close to home exciting. We hope that you will join Children's Services in moving these efforts forward for our young people, their families, and their communities, because it is our view that they deserve nothing less. Thank you very much.
So I want to bring up the panelists now. I'll quickly introduce them so we can have a little bit of a discussion before the Commissioner has to go back to City Hall. Mike Arsham is Executive Director of the Child Welfare Organizing Project. He's a social worker who's been working in this field for 20 years and has been Director of CWOP now for as long as I've been at the New School, 1998, I think. Next to him is Angela Watson, who is Program Director for the MST Juvenile Justice Initiative Project at SCO Family of Services in Brooklyn. And next to her is Gabrielle Prisco, who is Director of the Juvenile Justice Project at the Correctional Association and a former attorney in Juvenile Rights Division at Legal Aid. The young person who was going to be on the panel this morning, unfortunately, was unable to make it today. She called in not feeling well, so we'll do our best to represent her point of view, but I don't know that I can do that myself. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of young people, and I think that's certainly going to inform these questions. So I want to make sure that we get a couple of questions to the Commissioner. First off, let me get this out of the way. First off, you said there's going to be $22 million for these evidence-based programs. Is that going to come out of the $230 million that goes to preventive services, or is this on top of the baseline money for preventive? Do you know?
Did I say 22 million?
You did.
Did I say that?
Yeah.
So That's a very specific question, and I'm getting coached.
Yeah.
It's on top of. The answer is. Oh, I'm so happy that's the answer. How fortunate for me. So the answer is no. It's an addition. It's an additional $22 million. Thank you for saying that.
It's important.
It's a good answer.
If you look in the front
Next
of
question.
Yeah.
He's on a roll.
If you look in the front of the watch, there's a analysis of the budgets, and one of the interesting things over the last few years is that preventive has sort of been hitting $230 million and hasn't grown beyond that. This will be a pretty substantial boost to that with very intensive services. Another key question that I've heard from quite a few people, so many of the young people sent to upstate placement now, including the residential nonprofit programs, but especially the OCFS programs, have already been modified out of other programs. You know, they've already struggled in their initial adjudicated placement. So how is this going to be different? You're going to have nonprofit organizations running programs here in the city that are going to be for kids who've already struggled, or kids who would have already struggled mightily in such programs. How will these programs be different?
So that's a good question, and I think that the first answer that comes to my mind is that when young people have failed in the evidence-based models and been violated on probation, they have failed at home because even the evidence-based models have not provided strong enough supervision to them. And what having them close to home in a limited secure model offers is the combination of a limited secure setting that we will design that will be, we hope, smaller than most OCFS facilities, and have a behavior modification model that includes psychological and psychiatric treatment. But probably most critical is it will also include the involvement of a family member. And for young people who are 14 and 15, anybody who knows anything about adolescent brain development knows that separating them completely from the people that they love and the people that they know to try to extract rehabilitation, success, hope from them is very hard. And so my immediate answer to that question is it will be different if they know that their kin, I don't know if it's a mother, an aunt, a father, an uncle, will be coming to participate in sessions with them weekly, twice weekly. I think that we have to provide security and make sure that we're careful about that if they've been placed limited secure. But the incorporation of family into rehabilitation, I think, is promising and will, I hope, net better outcomes.
So, Mike, I want to give you a chance to pose a question to the commissioner based on what you heard him say. I mean, illuminating...
Is the panel here to ask me questions, too?
Well, because you're leaving so soon, we need to try and give that a chance. But, you know, what does it take to work with... You're on the B4B advisory board in Brooklyn, right, Michael? And so you've worked on both the juvenile justice side and the juvenile justice side. What does it take for young people to be secure in their communities, and how do you see what ACS is doing, strengths and weaknesses, quickly, if you can frame that?
And pose that as a question to
Yeah,
the
sure.
commissioner
If you want to pose a
less,
question
right?
to him, absolutely.
You know, Andrew, I don't think I'm going to do that. I think
Okay.
I'm going to answer the question I wish you had asked, if that's okay. Oh, okay. Is that better? Can people hear? Okay. So I made a new friend last week. I alienated a lot of old ones, but I made at least one new one, and her name is Helen Epstein, and she's a molecular biologist and a journalist. And in 1993, Helen moved to Uganda in hopes of developing a vaccine for HIV/AIDS. And that was devastating the African continent at that time, even to a greater extent than it is today. She didn't develop the vaccine, but over the next 15 years, she watched the people of Uganda develop community-based strategies for preventing infection and slowing the spread of the disease, some of which were remarkably effective, where government and philanthropic and ideologically driven campaigns like abstinence-only campaigns had failed completely. And she wrote a really fascinating book about this that I recommend highly. It's called The Invisible Cure. Helen Epstein, The Invisible Cure. I just want to start by reading a brief passage from it. Like many newcomers to Africa, I learned early on that the most successful AIDS projects tended to be conceived and run by Africans themselves, or by missionaries and aid workers with long experience in Africa. In other words, by people who really knew the culture. The key to their success resided in something for which the public health field currently has no name or program. It is best described as a sense of solidarity, compassion, and mutual aid that brings people together to solve a common problem that individuals can't solve on their own. The closest thing to it might be Harvard sociologist Felton Earle's concept of collective efficacy, meaning the capacity of people to come together and help others they're not necessarily related to. And this is the key part to me. Where missionaries and aid workers have intentionally or not suppressed this spirit, the results have been disappointing. Where they've built on these qualities, their efforts have often succeeded remarkably well. What this means to me is in the course of, and thanks for saying 20, but it's actually like closer to 35-year career in child welfare at this point, I've come to understand and believe in something very similar about protecting children. And that is that there is great strength and wisdom and compassion, even and maybe especially in the most economically stressed New York City communities. Parents and communities are the first and generally the best line of defense for their own children. When government and professionals and philanthropists support neighborhood-led self-help initiatives, communities can be very proficient at solving their own problems. But when outside actors attempt to impose their own vision, enforce their own standards of behavior, or simply to assume that they know what's best for people from cultures and communities very unlike their own, they can actually become just one more source of risk to children and families. Thank you. The integration of child welfare and juvenile justice services in New York City holds great promise and great potential, but it also holds this kind of risk. I agree totally with Commissioner Richter that Gladys Carrion has shown tremendous vision and courage in the work that she's done in moving us towards a community-based model of juvenile justice services, and I'm very happy that ACS seems to be embracing this shift. I guess my concern is that theoretically, child welfare should be years ahead of the curve, should be positioned to really offer viable models and examples of neighborhood-based services to a less evolved juvenile justice system. But the reality is, and this is, this spans the tenures of every ACS commissioner. We've heard a lot of rhetorical support for neighborhood-based services over the past decade, but our system still falls far short of really being positively integrated into the life of the communities in which its presence is most pervasive. Simply setting up an office in somebody's community is not neighborhood basing. Only 13.7% of New York City's foster children live in their home community districts, and we actually seem to be giving up on that as a measure of our success. The number of children receiving community-based preventive services has declined by 25% in the past 2 years, according to this issue of The Watch. And the preventive system has been badly damaged over the past couple of years. rather than being grounded in the principles on which it was founded, principles of respect and partnership with families. Increasingly, it's prescriptive, it's coercive. A large percentage of families receiving these services are court-ordered to receive the services. And as this issue of the watch points out, community partnership is not even mentioned in the strategic plan. Of course, we believe,
So I want to make sure Ron has time to respond
Yeah.
to you before he goes.
okay, I'll stop there, thanks.
So, Ron, I know you have to leave, but I want to get your response to that.
So, first of all, I have, enormous respect for Mike's commitment to child welfare and parents and families, which spans 35 years, maybe in chronology, but his imprint has extraordinary reach, and the value of his opinion is so important, because what's behind Mike is a cadre of parents who have been through the child welfare system. And so that's meaningful. And as a judge, I had lots and lots of parents in front of me who went through conferences and talked to me about what it was like to be in conferences and the quality of the information that they came out of conferences with, which was ranged from they had a completely perfect understanding of what their rights were and who I was as a judge, to they came out of a conference thinking that, the decision had already been made and I was a rubber stamp for the child protective manager. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. With respect to prevention and the fact that the strategic plan that Mike references doesn't say community in it, I think that, as I said during my remarks, parents are community, and each priority in the strategic plan talks about, other than the first one, which is workforce empowerment and making the people who work at ACS feel valued, which I think is the only way we're going to get our folks to do their job in a way that shows caring for our clients. Each of the priorities is about empowering the parents of our youth, whether it's in a child protective setting or in a or teen permanency. It's my guess, and I don't know what's in Mike's mind, that there was a particular difficulty with the TPR part of my strategic plan, of our ACS strategic plan, because I am really troubled, very troubled by our numbers on termination of parental rights cases and by the number of young people in New York City who have been, we just looked at numbers with respect to kinship guardianship, where we've got over 1,000 kids who have been in the same foster home, the same kinship foster home, for over 3 years. And that's not right for children, because little kids do not live in adult time frames. And so I, in the strategic plan, laid out the fact that in New York, the law is within 15 out of 22 months you file a TPR. We didn't make up the law. The law is our elected officials made up the law. That's how our government works. And I laid it out, and we're not filing TPRs. We're in violation of the law. So I think that struck a chord with a lot of people who care about parents and said, gosh, they're going to come down on parents without providing preventive services, without providing services in people's communities. And there's a real imbalance there that is mean-spirited and unfair. I think that what Mike is talking about is not wrong or misguided. I think that we are looking carefully at the quality of our preventive services and how we're doing. We are trying to figure out to what extent some of our preventive services should be more evidence-based, because some of our families' needs are complicated or more complicated than general preventive can attend to. And we take what he says seriously. So I would never just say, no, he's wrong, because he's someone who has substantial experience and who behind him has the input from the people who are our clients.
All right. Thanks. Is this still on? So I know you have to run now, but thank you so much for
I want to say
time.
something, though. I want to say that if there are questions that people have on issues that someone isn't here to answer, namely on preventive services and issues in the watch unrelated to juvenile justice, because we can cover juvenile justice, Andrew will figure out a way to have those sent to me. And to the extent that we can provide answers and Andrew can provide a forum for there to be a Q&A, I'm happy to facilitate that, because I don't want my leaving to leave people who have questions about that part of the watch to go unanswered. I know you won't have the back and forth, but I'm happy to accommodate that so that you don't.
Right.
Okay?
We will figure it out.
And I thank you all very much for being here.
So I'm going to bring up Larry Bushing. Larry is Executive Deputy Commissioner at ACS, who overseeing the juvenile justice side, the Division of Youth and Family Justice.
Can I just say, I'm so glad the commissioner said that before he left about taking more questions. When he was talking about, he knew we couldn't anticipate millions and millions of questions, and I knew he was leaving, I started to get very nervous.
Right.
So I'm glad I don't have to answer all of them today.
We'll make sure you get every question about preventive services. So we'll talk about juvenile justice side since Larry is up here. And I think, Gabrielle, you've got some deep experience on this. One of the issues that's been raised and that the commissioner spoke a little bit about is planning this city-based system. I mean, there's not a lot of time before, if this gets through the legislature, there will not be a lot of time before you have to have contracts up and running and organizations up and running. Non-secure, I think, is supposed to happen as soon as this September. Is that right? So first off, Gabrielle, could you define non-secure and limited secure first?
Sure.
And second, what kind of involvement would you like to see the advocates and community organizations and community residents have in the process of deciding who gets these contracts and how the programs are shaped?
Great, thanks. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Hi, thank you. First of all, thank you, Andrew, and the new school for providing this forum, for inviting me to speak. And I just want to start by saying I would echo what Commissioner Richter said, that this is a unique moment for us to serve New York City's children close to home, which is something that the Correctional Association has supported for many, many, many years, long before this legislation, long before the Department of Justice found the horrible conditions inside state-operated facilities. However, we also believe that the details of the plan, which I'm going to speak to in a moment, are paramount. And we believe that the operation of this system will transcend particular administrations. It will transcend Commissioner Richter. It will transcend Executive Deputy Commissioner Bushing. It will probably transcend my tenure as an advocate. And what that means is that we have a moment where we don't need to just bring children home. We need to do it right, and we need to really be at the drawing board. We have money right now, about $12 million is allocated in the state budget this year towards this program. About $9 million of that will be offset by the closure of OCFS facilities. But we have a moment where we have political attention, we have money, we have momentum, and we have people of goodwill, including the people in this room and the leaders of the various agencies. And so the Correctional Association and myself as an advocate who's represented children in family court and has also worked on the policy side of things, we're thinking very deeply about how do we do this in a way that ensures durable protections for children that transcend the Bloomberg administration, that transcend the Cuomo administration, that transcend, maybe our lifetimes, because children in care in every jurisdiction nationwide are at risk. It doesn't matter if they're placed in their home community. It doesn't matter if they're placed 500 miles from home. Those things matter for a lot of things. They matter for community outcomes. They matter for children's well-being. But it's also true that kids right now on Rikers Island are at risk. Right? They're close to us, but they're at risk. Kids in secure detention facilities right now, very close to home, are at risk. And I'm going to talk about some of those numbers later. So it's not just about where kids are placed, it's about how we place them and what kind of protections we have in place. And I admire the work of ACS to really think about those protections and to think about oversight. We saw some slides on that, and I'm going to kind of dig deeper a little bit into that. But I just want to start by framing that issue. And, I have felt in the year or so since we've been talking about realignment, sometimes I get phone calls from reporters or people, and they say, do you support the city or do you support the state? And I'm like, I support children, actually. It's not about Gladys Carrion or Ron Richter. It's not about the Correctional Association. It's about children. And it's about making sure that the mechanisms in place for children, the protections, the oversight, the minimum standards of care travel with children and are instituted in a way right now that they're not in any facility, regardless of who runs it. And we have the chance to be a national leader, right? And to really have, like the way we talk about the Missouri model, for people to say, this is how they did it in New York when they went to the drawing board. And I hope that we transcend politics in doing that. And I sound a little bit like Obama, right? I'd like to transcend the Republicans and the Democrats. I'd like to transcend the city. Maybe I'm not quite as smooth as
Good
him,
luck
but
with that.
Yeah. All right, that was bad. I read the audience didn't really respond to it. I was like, I'm definitely not as cool as he is, and I'm not the president, and I can't sing. But what I mean is transcend sort of the politics of this moment to really think about putting children and communities first. So to go to your question about what we'd like to see with regard to communities. So I think this planning process is really important. And as Andrew pointed out, there's a little bit of challenge with timing, that if the legislation passes, the legislation sort of would authorize the city to bring New York's kids close to home and to start operating its own facilities, non-secure and limited secure, and I will define those in a moment, in September for non-secure facilities and in April of 2013 for limited secure. As we all are aware, there's city contractual processes. They'll be doing a negotiated acquisition in order to find providers. All of that has front-loaded time. So what that means is those plans are already underway, as they have to be, right, if we're going to have these systems operational by September. So there's a little bit of a tension between engaging communities and advocates and family members in all the ways that we heard Mike speak about, when at the same time a very real planning process is already underway and has been underway and has to be. So what should we do because of that? So I'm going to start with the definitions and then talk for a moment about policy solutions and then wrap up because I know there's other folks and other questions. So non-secure facilities are a misnomer. That's what I want to say. Non-secure does not mean non-secure. They're actually locked facilities. There's barbed wire sometimes, mesh over the windows or bars. One of the things I really hope New York City does is change some of the nomenclature because it's really confusing. Because we say kids are in non-secure placements, but they're actually prisons. So it's the equivalent of like a low security. On the adult side, the way we have like minimum security, and we have medium and we have maximum. So non-secure facility in the current OCFS operated system is a locked facility. I've just in one recently, mesh over the walls, kids in really, really awful uniforms. Kids wear sneakers with shoelaces that define their behavioral level. That's their distinguishing feature, the color of their shoelaces. And they're not free to leave. So non-secure does not mean non-secure. Non-secure means minimum security. relatively speaking. So that's what a non-secure facility is. It is the lowest level of confined care in state-operated placements. Again, I'm using the current state definitions for kids charged with juvenile delinquencies. So juvenile delinquencies are kids as young as the age of 7 and up until their 16th birthday in New York State who have committed an act which would be a crime but for their age. New York is one of only 2 states where all 16 and 17-year-olds are automatically prosecuted as adults, regardless of what they do. So we're not talking about kids who are prosecuted as adults.
So how's limited secure different
So
from that?
limited secure is a sort of a rough analog of a medium secure in the adult system. It is the highest level of care for a child charged with juvenile delinquency, with a rare exception that I'm going to speak about in a moment, and it's a higher security level. They often have barbed wire fences currently in the state model. So I was just in one where, there's big, high fences with barbed wires across the top, but just sort of more secure, higher restrictions than non-secure. But sometimes functionally, frankly, they're the same. If you went inside a non-secure or limited secure, you might not know the difference.
So are there examples, Larry, you would know, are there examples of nonprofit organizations running this kind of facility in New York or only elsewhere?
So the analog that I would draw is in our non-secure detention system, we have 15 group homes here located in New York City. They're right next to, they're in neighborhoods. They have neighbors right next door. They don't have barbed wire fences around them. Well, some of them have fences around them. One of the things I really agree that the non-secure terminology is a misnomer, and particularly as we think about having facilities that are in group homes and things like that that are close to community, I think people get a little nervous when you say we're moving a home for kids who have been convicted of crimes right next to you, and it's non-secure. I think it's really probably in other jurisdictions they call it staff secure, meaning that they don't have all the hardware that many of the other the more secure facilities would have, but they have a staffing level and they have mechanisms in place that prevent youth from leaving. And if you try to leave, they will be stopped. Right. Sometimes we have a small number of kids who get out of our non-secure facilities, but it's a relatively small number. They're run by the nonprofits. They're very much in buildings that, for the most part, are like the homes around them. Mm-hmm. Kids have bedrooms. Some of the facilities, they encourage the kids to cook with the staff and to learn various skills. They have recreation sites. I see a number of the providers are here in the room. So that's kind of what the analog, I think, could be for the placement facilities, just to put it together kind of roughly. They're not service-rich, I can say that. They're primarily designed to make sure that kids get from the point where the case is filed against them in court up until the case is adjudicated. Right. And so there are not a ton of services in there, but in terms of conditions and design of the location, that's similar. I would say there's one other exception, as I see Cindy's looking at me saying, when are you going to talk about the Boys Town placement homes? OCFS contracts with Boys Town to have 2 facilities in Brooklyn that are similar to what I just described, and they have teaching parents or some word like that, and basically this is a couple who works with the youth in the home to create as similar to a home setting as possible and to teach skills of that kid that they would get in their home, and also works with the parents to give the parents that type of structure and tools as to how to monitor and supervise and support their young.
So you foresee these new ones will be much more service rich than the detention or the pre-placement programs you're now. Yeah. So how are you going to forecast the capacity? How do you have one of the big problems with the state has been this massive capacity that taxpayers are paying for. How do you avoid that situation?
And you're trying to strike a balance, right? You don't want to go in and say, shortchange yourself So you don't have sufficient capacity, and then you end up kind of having not as good facilities as you want. On the other hand, you don't want to pour all your resources into facilities. What we did was we essentially have taken and this is what the bill does, it takes the current population that's in limited secure and non-secure. And as the commissioner, and as commissioner showed, that number has been brought down by 60% since 2006. So to take that number, we would have basically, instead of us sending money upstate to pay half the bill for the state, the money would instead be coming down to New York City to support us establishing these residences here. And it's a block grant. So we are incentivized to continue to develop richer evidence-based or promising practices, interventions that are community-based. If we can do that, we can actually then, if we're successful in that, we can then bring that population down even further.
Okay. I want to bring Angela into this. Angela, you've been doing this work, similar work in London, and now here, the MST program here in Brooklyn. If you could talk a little bit about how your program works. Often, some of the cases you've described are pretty intense, right? I mean, these are kids many of the kids who are going to be going into these evidence-based programs, or who already have been adjudicated for pretty serious crimes and sometimes repeated crimes. Tell us a little bit about that work, and particularly your relationship with the families and how you engage them.
Well, a typical case that we would get would be usually male, predominantly male, usually aged between 14 and 16. 80% already have ACS involvement, so that could mean educational neglect or involvement with Child Protective Services, which we heard a lot about earlier. They will have committed multiple offences: burglary, assault, robbery, usually burglary, assault, robbery on people that they know. There's a long disaffection with school, and usually our youth are around 3 years behind with hardly any credits. So what we're dealing with is a lot of families that are raised in poverty in projects around Brooklyn and Manhattan. So they're lacking in community connection. So what we have to do, we go into the home 4 to 6 hours a week at the beginning of treatment, and then we work with the caregiver to try and get them to take control back for their youth and with their youth. So we would be looking at involving our youth in pro-social activities to try to get them away from gang involvement, to try to get them to be all the things that they're interested in that they've never been able to take on board before. We can help with that. So our therapists go into the home, and the kitchen table approach that Commissioner Richter was talking about is what MST is. We go into the home 4 to 6 hours a week, and we will work with the family. We are there all the time with the family. So we kind of, is that the kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, tell us a little bit about a case. Give us an example of, I mean, obviously you can't give the personal details, but, you know, a kid who's been arrested for burglary and assault, a mother who's not eager to work with you, who's already been through the PINS process, been upset. How do you deal with that?
It's quite difficult. But what we do is we have to make sure that the families know that we're competent, that the therapists are competent, they're not judgmental, they're there to help the family take control back with this youth. So what we'll try and do is we'll engage them, and we'll try and get mom, it's usually mom, single parent, to work with us to look at how she's been parenting and we're strength-based, so we will look at what has been going right in the home and try and work with that and look at anger management, if mom has been finding it really hard, she's losing her temper all the time with the youth, to try and look at ways of controlling that and try and look at ways of praising the youth, because that's a lot of the time that does not happen in families.
Well, one of the things I remark on, having spoken with some of the young people who've been through this, is how before placement, before landing either upstate or in the system, they've not been going home, they've not been spending time with their parents, they're alienated from their parents, and having been through this process, those I've spoken with anyway are now actually have pretty solid relationships with their parents, at least in the time following the program, which is fairly remarkable, sort of an example, I mean, emblematic of what seems to be achievable with really professional services that are done intensively, which government usually can't afford. So we're talking about scaling up those programs and programs like them. The one other question I have for you, I guess, is how do you make sure, what is fundamental to making this work so that you're sure these young people are at home in the evening when they're supposed to be home, so that they don't get violated for their probation? I mean, what are the mechanisms for changing behavior?
Some of the mechanisms are to keep, to connect families with communities, and to get them to, we try and find out how the extended family works, how friends can help with that. So it's kind of, the parent isn't alone, so the parent can mobilise social supports to help with trying to keep the youth at home. So if the youth does AWOL, it's about the families and the therapists going out and looking around the places that the youth usually frequents. And that's something that we find out early on in treatment. We try to find out where they're going, who they're with, what they're doing. And then the therapist and the caregiver they're empowered to go out and try and find where the youth is.
And you have a pretty clearly defined system of incentives for the kids too, right?
Yeah, I mean, incentives can be, they're not always materialistic. Mm-hmm. They're not always gift cards. They're things like an hour extra, staying up an hour extra, working with probation. They may be able to get an hour's extra off of their curfew, that kind of thing. So it can be, you know, we've had parents who have printed out a certificate and given it to their youth to say, well done, you've done really well, you've attended school 85%, whereas when at the beginning of treatment, it was maybe 10%. So those kind of things work as well as, yes, we do have a reward system and a consequence system as well.
Right. You know, clearly much of what's happening in these systems is compelling. It's stuff that a lot of people in this room have worked for a long time. Mike, you made a very strong point that I want to come back to about the idea that juvenile justice and child welfare policy and so much else in the human services world can only be successful, or could be so much more successful, if they're developed with people in the communities most affected. The flip side of that, given what Larry's describing about these group homes, is the danger of NIMBYism and the sort of fear of these programs. What would be the best way, given the short timeline here, what would be the best way to engage communities in a positive way to make this work? Do you have ideas to put out there?
Yes, and let me just start by saying, you know, MST sounds like a wonderful model. I mean, the more I listened to you, the more similar it sounded to the work that we were doing at Reedland, what's now called the Harlem Children's Zone, like early in the 1980s. So, you know, a lot of this is not brand new. The idea of community partnership is not brand new. There are people who've been doing it. We use evidence-based like as if it was a mantra, but we're very selective about what we're willing to consider evidence-based. If you look at the bridge builders in Highbridge, the same research institute that's been retained to evaluate community partnership, Chapin Hall, maybe the premier research institute in the nation, in my unbiased opinion, did a multi-year evaluation of the bridge builders that showed very encouraging results. Why is that not being considered evidence-based? Okay, I think there's nothing wrong with putting emphasis on evidence-based models, but they don't all have to be imported from somewhere outside of New York City. There are people who've been pouring their hearts and souls into this work for over a decade now, and who need to be better enfranchised in this strategic plan. I'll stop there and give someone else a chance.
Okay. Gabrielle,
Yeah.
can you comment on that? Same
Yeah,
point?
I can. I hope everyone claps at the end of what I say, too. I'm going to try for that. So I want to say I think one of the things that we would really hope to see is for the city to release its plan as soon as possible. The legislation says that one community hearing has to be held and that the plan has to be up 30 days before the community hearing. I think one community hearing in a city as big as New York with only 30 days notice to communities, many of the communities where these young people come from have literacy issues, lack resources, do not necessarily have the ability to access the web where the plan will be posted. I think there's some really serious concerns about what a public hearing is when there's one hearing probably during working hours when many poor people in the most impacted communities don't have the kinds of vacation days I have, for example, to take a day and go to, I mean, I get paid to go to hearings, right? But other people don't have that opportunity. So what does community engagement look like when we talked about these, the RFPs are already being circulated or about to be circulated. We already have a set of providers we know are the authorized agencies, the folks that the city will be contracted with, and a lot of the plans, again, by necessity, are underway. We hope that they are, right? Because if the kids are going to come home in September, we need to have an infrastructure in place. At the same time, how are we involving advocates and communities? So it's really hard when there's been no public release of a plan yet. And I understand from the city's perspective that the authorizing legislation was just released in Governor Cuomo's proposal. So that provides some challenges. So it's not about criticizing the city or state. It's about what do we do moving forward given what is, right? What is? This is what is. What do we do? So one of the things is to really draw on local knowledge. One of the folks in the room is the Reverend Ruben Austria from Community Connections for Families for Youth, and he has a fantastic position paper that's recently released on ways that we can engage communities. Reverend Austria has been working in Mott Haven and the Bronx to develop local knowledge, and I really encourage you to speak to him afterwards. Ruben, can you just maybe raise your hand? Sure. It's Reverend Ruben, R-U-B-E-N, Austria, A-U-S-T-R-I-A. And some of the ideas, and I'm going to be borrowing a little bit from Reverend Austria's work here, but are to identify, invest, and share leadership with community leaders. So it's more than having one parent, right? We've all been on these panels where there's a kid or a parent. It's often the same parent, right? It's often the parent who has a master's degree who winds up on a lot of panels. And you know, again, it's not about criticizing a particular leader or a particular administration. These problems transcend New York, right? But it's really about digging deep and saying, how do we empower communities? Communities in New York City know how to work with their youth, right? The most impacted communities have support structures already in place, both informal and formal, for working with at-risk youth. And city agencies and advocacy organizations, I hold the mirror up to myself and my work, right? We have to work with folks and share decision-making power. We have to share resources. A community-based organization might be working on a budget of $4,000, right? And then we say, like, well, they can't meet our standards, right? We, and I'm the we in here too, they can't come to a conference prepared to talk about this issue at this level of detail. Or sometimes people call me and they say, you know, can you bring a youth to this, be on this task force? And I'm like, well, the task force has a 300-page report, and the kid has a 5th grade reading level, right? And no computer. So how are we engaging youth voices? Oh, good. Now I get claps in the middle. Thank you.
There you go.
But it's really real, right? And another, again, borrowing from Reverend Austria's work, is about developing learning communities, because there's a performance-driven, data-based approach that stakeholders have and expect. But there's also local knowledge. Mike spoke about that. And there's qualitative research, right? People in communities know what works. Okay, so my father's in the room, who's a guidance counselor on Staten Island for many, many years and works with a local nonprofit, African Refuge, that their budget is, a budget of a large nonprofit is what they deal with. What we deal with in like a couple of weeks is their yearly budget. But they have folks who've worked in the community with kids from Liberia for, really struggling, kids who are former war soldiers, right? And these are just community members who have mentored kids, who've worked with them in the Park Hill projects, who aren't at these kinds of meetings, right? I mean, my father's here because he's my father, but the folks from Park Hill who are mentoring kids from Liberia, mentoring former child war soldiers who are now here struggling to acclimate, who are dealing with very serious trauma, right? That kind of community-based knowledge is not currently represented in juvenile justice reform.
Right,
so we need to have, twice? Thank you. We need to have learning communities where we bring this kind of qualitative and data-driven knowledge together. We also have to share data with communities. So I will say, a lot of the information that I saw today was the first time I've seen it publicly presented. And this is what I do as a professional. Every day. I read this stuff at midnight in my house, right? To communities, I imagine, I don't want to make too many assumptions, but most of the people in this room are not community members from the communities most impacted by juvenile justice. Some of us are, some of you may be, right? But many are not. Many people in this room, again, I know some people in this room who have had kids in the juvenile justice system, but many of those people are not represented. And how is this information getting to them? There needs to be transparency. So the data, for example, on the harms to kids in the system is available. So right now, the City Council requires the Division of Youth and Family Justice and ACS to post on their website reports about kids who are harmed in city custody, which is happening right now. In fiscal year 2011, there were 13 indicated child abuse allegations of kids inside city facilities. Those are just the allegations that were found to be true of child abuse, right? And those are those are just the ones that got investigated and found, and that actually made it to the point that there was a finding. And for the child protective workers in the room, that's a pretty intense process, right? But is that information available for communities to respond to and to say, look, kids are getting abused in facilities, in city custody. What can we do about that? Can we go inside those facilities? These facilities are largely locked from the public, and I know Larry spoke, Executive Deputy Commissioner Bushing spoke about the group home model, but we also know that the legislation authorizes the city to take over, to lease for $1 a year, the OCFS facilities. And we imagine, and it seems likely, that the city plans to open some of the current OCFS facilities, which are not brownstones, with the exception of the Brooklyn to Brooklyn model, to open those kinds of facilities. And the legislation allows for that and says that that's probably going to happen. So are we going to have a locked facility where, again, community members aren't regularly visiting? One of the things we'd like to see is facilities, whether they're group homes or larger facilities, open to the public. We'd also, and I'm going to end just with two other quick things, is to increase the administrative capacity of neighborhood organizations, to work with small neighborhood organizations that are already in communities and help those communities grow so that they can be partners in juvenile justice. So we need data transparency, we need shared decision making, more than an advisory board or more than a parent on a task force, but we have to be willing to cede some of the authority, which is hard for city agencies, it's hard for nonprofits, it's hard for me, but we have to be willing to cede some of the authority to shared decision making with people in communities so that it's not just a top-down approach, but it's true partnership. And the research shows that when you do this, you get safer outcomes. The research shows that when you involve families and communities in the juvenile justice system, kids do better, and communities are safer, because communities are where kids come from, and communities are where kids are loved, and communities are where kids in placement are going to come home to.
So one of the tensions in the in the community partnerships that we looked at, some of the best of them are able to reach exactly the kind of organization that your father's working with. But on the other hand, these are funded by city government. Like you say, it's ceding power. It's a very difficult thing to ask of government to fund community organizers who are essentially there in the ideal world to advise them, sometimes to oppose them. So that's just to put out there for thought. I want to make sure we have time for questions. Is my mic on? T? Okay. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand now and somebody will come around. Keep your hand up. Some people are going to come around with mics, and then I'm going to ask a question while we're doing that. Larry, one of the questions I've heard, another question I've heard repeatedly is, to what degree is the NYPD involved in the planning and thinking about this effort?
So we have the NYPD serving in a number of capacities in which we look at juvenile justice and plan for juvenile justice issues. The deputy mayor has a quarterly meeting where we go over all the data. We talk about what's happening, what the trends are, where the arrests are occurring, what the big issues are with regard to crime. We take into account their concerns when we're thinking about these evidence-based programs or other programs we're developing. We work with them to make sure that we are being responsive to keeping communities safe. They were at the table with us. They were quite supportive of the Close to Home initiative. They had some concerns, which they voiced about, community safety, but I think they similarly see this as a positive for being able to work with kids better in the community and keep them closer to home. And, they also want to see crime reductions, and they also want to see kids safely being in their communities. So they've been part of the conversation throughout.
Is there anybody with a mic with a question right now? Yeah, over here.
Hi, I'm Tom Cox from SEO Family of Services. I had maybe a question in disguise. It might be a comment, but Mike pointed out that 22 million was the figure for these evidence-based programs. He also pointed out, and I agree, that the evidence-based models, they're fantastic. They do great things. But I would also wonder if we should consider that 22 million means, if you translated it into more preventive services, could mean 4,500 families served in a year, or about 44 new programs created. Or for community partnership, which is why I came today, there could be 146 of them done. And out of the Child Welfare Watch a study or report here, we see that there's not enough money to do the community partnership task, although I would put it the other way, or another way, which is that the partnerships already do fantastic things. There should be more of them and more money. Otherwise, we're going to think that it's not worth the effort and we should not fund them at all, even though they're really not that much money. Anyhow, I was just put into the equation here the mathematics and finances.
I noticed on the commissioner's PowerPoint, he said with the 22 million, they plan to do 3,000 families in the intensive sort of MST type of model. Those are very intensive programs. They cost between $17,000 to $20,000 per family. In a lot of ways, it's exactly the kind of thing so many people have wanted to see for so long in terms of close work with families and resources for families. But does it mean less for others? Unfortunately, Larry's on the JJ side, so he's not in a position to answer that. But Angela, I do want to ask you, if we were to ramp this up on a scale, it sounds like we will be, or New York City will be ramping this up on a scale to reach 3,000 more families just on the child welfare side and potentially more on the juvenile justice side. What does it take to create a program like yours in terms of staffing? Where do you find the people to do this work?
We have a very rigorous recruitment process that we look for our therapists that are LC and LMSWs. They may have a mental health background and a background with doing family therapy. So, I mean, in answer to your question, how would we do it? We're already here. We're already doing it. All the programs in New York, we're already doing JJI. We're already doing MST. So we're licensed. We have all the consultancy. All our consultants are in place. All we would need to do was train new staff, and then we're up and ready to go. So that's the beauty of having these teams here.
Right. Interesting. Larry, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would just say, although my focus is primarily on juvenile justice, I guess a couple of things that I would say is we are. A lot of this preventive teen work is building on the work that's been done in the family assessment program, PINS diversion, and showing tremendous success there, which is one of the areas that I oversee. And Sarah Hemmeter and Jamani Hilton did amazing work in pulling that together. So it's building on those lessons. And I know it's kind of funny that we're saying, well, it's only $22 million, right? But it's in a time when, we're finding our budget cut and cut and cut. Hopefully we'll get good news this morning. I think, having that $22 million does show that this is recognized as a priority and something that we can build on. And one of the things that's positive about, I understand the concerns about relying on just an evidence-based approach, but one of the things that's positive about it is it makes a very strong point when you're seeking funding to demonstrate that the programs are in fact effective in making a difference.
Yeah.
It's not the only way to do it, but it's one way to do that.
Right. So, Mike, over there.
Hi, my name is Lorraine McNeil. I'd like to ask two questions. From a community-based level, what are the processes or mechanisms for organizations or individuals that want to share in, want to bring their expertise, want to share promising practices to get involved? And also from a policy level, how can people who live in the community really get involved with the development and shaping of policy that affects this population?
Good question.
Yeah.
So
Larry?
I can take a first shot, but then I imagine Gabrielle will want to join in as well. One thing that I would definitely recommend is, we all have a lot on our plate, but I think we're very open to meeting with folks and learning about new models and seeing kind of what community programs are out there and building upon them. I know some of them have very, very small funding streams, but actually if you look at, as the commissioner kind of referenced, if you look at where most of the kids live who come into our system, it's a very finite, it's probably 5 or 6 communities that have the vast majority of kids that come into our system. We can probably, most of us in the room could probably take them off the top of our heads. So a little bit of money well placed in an area where we're seeing a lot of what's driving our system could make a tremendous difference. So we'd be very happy to kind of meet with you and talk about potential opportunities. A lot of what's going to happen is obviously in terms of who's bidding on the programming that we're putting out for, those are probably going to be some of the larger, more better organized, better established programs, but they do a lot of partnerships. So we can do, if nothing else, we can do some introductions and say, hey, I know you have a lot of kids that are in this particular neighborhood, or you're located in this particular neighborhood. Did you know about this organization? How can we work together, and how can that organization help you with the kids that are in your care, and how can you help that organization? Policy-wise, again, building a relationship, we have advisory boards, we do community forums. We'd love to kind of hear input. I really would welcome, we do have parents, we have kids who have been through the system on a lot of the boards we do, and that can be an often really valuable role.
Is there... Don? Yeah, okay.
Hi,
Abigail.
I'm Abigail Kramer, and I'm cheating because I write for Child Welfare Watch. But one of the stipulations in close to home legislation was that the city presents a plan for reducing disproportionate minority contact. City has some really well-recognized work around the risk assessment instrument, but I'm wondering what other sort of concrete steps the city is going to take in creating that plan.
So we've been working with a lot of people in this room, city agencies, advocates, youth, as part of a DMC reduction strategy group. I forget exactly what the group is called, but it's convened by the Vera Institute. And we've been focused on the issue for about a year and a half, making concrete recommendations. The timing of this is going to be a little tough because the report is not finalized yet from Vera. But I think the work that's being done, we've been engaged in this process for some time, and that work can really help inform that aspect of the plan. And as you say, in our city, we don't just have a disproportionate minority problem. We have a almost exclusively minority population that comes through the juvenile justice system. So juvenile justice reform work by itself, child welfare, is by definition going to be a DMC strategy. But the Vera report, which was funded by, I believe, DCJS, will help us to identify additional strategies and concrete strategies that we can employ in addressing that aspect of the plan.
Yeah, over there.
Good morning. My question is for Ms. Briscoe. You had mentioned that given the time frames that getting our kids back home before September, there were designated agencies that were already in process. In terms of just community knowledge of that, who are those agencies? And I also have to say to the commissioner, just because larger organizations are larger, they're not necessarily more organized or well managed than some of those organizations in the community who have been doing this work for a very long time. And it also often raises conflict when these larger, more organized organizations come into community without seeking partnership with those organizations that have been there. Could you comment on that, please?
Thanks for the question. So I actually am going to briefly answer, and then maybe Executive Deputy Commissioner Bushing could pick it up, since I think in some ways it's the city that will be issuing the RFP, so they have more specific knowledge. My understanding is that it will be what's called a negotiated acquisition, which means that the city will open up the contracts to folks who are already considered authorized agencies under the current system, and the current social service law sort of sets up a process for defining what is an authorized agency in the process of state approval. That may be incorrect. Again, the plan has not been released, so I'm not sure of all of the specifics of it. So perhaps Executive Deputy Commissioner Bushing could speak to that. That is our understanding up to this time. I do want to say, and I think your point is really a great one, and it builds on a previous question about mechanisms, not just around smaller agencies, but also really meaningful community engagement, and that we would like to see from an advocacy perspective, formal mechanisms. While I think it's, relationship building is really important, and we'd like to participate in that as well. I would love people who are interested in joining our coalition to let me know afterwards. But also what we're really hoping that the city's plan will include is specific mechanisms for ongoing community participation, not just in the planning process before September or before April, but the ongoing participation of the system. And that data is key to that. And that also touches on Abigail's question about disproportionate or almost exclusive minority confinement, which is that national research on reducing racial and ethnic disparities show that one of the best tools is the public release of data that is again, aggregate data. We're not talking about children's names or identities, but that's broken down by race, ethnicity, geography, gender, which actually means biological sex for these purposes, and offense. That system is called REGO. It's been developed by the Hayward Burns Institute, which works on this issue, and says you need to look at data at every point in the system, because children of color are not just in the system more regularly. They are disproportionately impacted as they move through the system, and the deeper into the system, the worse the impact gets.
Right.
So kids of color are sanctioned more harshly than white kids, and they move deeper into the system. They move more easily into the adult system. Basically, anytime there's discretion, white kids wind up in a better position.
Right.
And that has been shown. So I think data is key to community engagement.
Mike.
Yeah, can I just say I couldn't agree more strongly, and I just I wrote this down because I didn't want it to go unsaid today. In New York City, black children and white children each represent about 25% of the total child population. In foster care, black children represent 56%, white children 4%. The disparity is even more stark in juvenile justice. Of the New York City youth currently in OCFS custody, 58% are African American, 1% are white.
Right. How many of you, speaking of involvement, input, listening, if we are able to do something like this again in late April or May, I'd like to see a show of hands. How many people would find that valuable? Good. All right. So we'll do our best. Last question. I want to tie this together. Essentially, we don't know yet for sure that the legislature is going to pass the juvenile justice proposal as it's put forward by the governor, though it seems very likely since it's supported by the mayor and probably supported by Shelley Silver. We do know that the city is about to invest $22 million in these intensive programs for teens identified through Child Protective Services. We know that the partnerships exist, the community partnerships exist as a vehicle for community engagement, community involvement, could readily be applied into this process if there were space and resources to do it. I would have asked this to Commissioner Richter, but we just have to put it out there. You know, is there a commitment to engaging across the neighborhoods in a substantive way, more than just with a done deal, going out to communities and saying we need input? And I mean, it's a rhetorical question because you know the answer is yes, but the question is how. So I don't know if anybody else wants to make final comments in that spirit.
I just kind of, with regard to the plan, which I think is kind of a key component of this, and which is what a lot of the focus has been, I think what you've seen coming up to this point is a real effort to do that. If you look, the Department of Probation put together a disposition reform steering committee that included city agencies, advocates, community groups. Some of the folks who serve on that group sit here. We really looked at across the system at the idea of how do we improve the system for youth, for families, for communities, and being responsive to what the needs are before us. The system, as Gabrielle said, community outreach, if you can involve communities and make the communities part of the solution, that's going to be a longer lasting solution and benefit to everybody. So that committee met and put together a report. Largely, it focused on not just on the residential care piece, which is what we spent a lot of time talking about today, but a lot on the community-based programming that can be put in place. The Department of Probation, I saw Ana Bermudez here, and now I don't see her, but I see some other friends from the Department of Probation, is putting out a lot of contracting to work with community-based groups so that probation is not just an intervention that focuses on monitoring, but really probation officers who are working with kids can be assisted by programs that are in the community to help integrate youth in the community and help them have better outcomes. We are committed to doing the visits to communities. One of the things we've tried to do with our detention facilities is open them up. When I first started, I was amazed by how many people in the neighborhood said, and not open them up to let people out, but open them up so we could, I always have to be careful with what I say about that. But I was always surprised by how many people when in the neighborhood said, what is this place? I never even knew what this place is. On one hand, that makes me feel good because it's not creating, it's not, nobody's escaping and creating problems in the neighborhood. But on the other hand, I don't think that's as good as you would, that's not exactly what you want, because I think you want communities to reach back into the facilities and work with the young people in the facilities and help them to reintegrate back into the community. We've been doing that. Sonia Galars is here, who focuses a tremendous amount on that work. In terms of data sharing, I think if you look on our website, there's an enormous amount of data on there, and I think we have a real commitment to that. The bill that Gabrielle mentioned is one that we supported. And so, I testify in front of the city council every month. So there's, I think, a real effort to kind of get out there and include input. Obviously, there's a tension as you're trying to get, as Gabrielle described, as you're trying to get things done very quickly and you have time limitations. But the more we can involve communities, the better the plan is going to be. So it's in everybody's interest that we do that.
All right. Well, we promised we'd get you out of here at 10:30, and it's 10:36. So thanks to the panel, and thanks all of you for coming.